Okay, well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Uh, Today's topic is chosen to mark World Mental Health Day. So today's topic, Mental Health and Wellbeing, HE Minds Matter, is a webinar organised by jobs.ac.uk in partnership with Advance HE. And I'll be chairing today's session. My name's Helen Webster, and I'm one of Advance HE's senior consultants with a remit for student success, which includes things like well-being. But I'm absolutely delighted to chair today's webinar, which is focusing on the topic of staff well-being and mental health. We know that in our higher education institutions, staff referrals to counselling and to occupational health have absolutely soared in recent years. We know that the stresses of the pandemic have impacted on academic and professional services staff just as much as they have on students. It's been a tough few years for everybody. And while there's been quite a focus on student mental health and student well-being, what causes it, what kind of things work to help alleviate it, and innovations like the Student Minds Mental Health Charter, there's probably been less attention on what's happening among staff in academia in our higher education institutions. So today's webinar, we wanted to look at whether higher education is experiencing a mental health crisis among staff, what kind of challenges we face, and what we can do to address them. And we've assembled an absolutely fantastic panel to discuss this very complex, very tricky topic and help us get a better understanding of what kinds of things are impacting on poor mental health and wellbeing amongst higher education staff, and what we can do as institutions and as individuals to help support our wellbeing and that of our colleagues. So the webinar will include a live Q&A at the end to answer your questions. We also have some questions submitted in advance by those of you who've booked to attend today. So we will be centering the discussion around those. I'd like to add a brief disclaimer, though. This session, being about mental health and well-being, means that we may well discuss some topics which might be upsetting or challenging. We will be providing at the end of the session information on how to get help if you should need it, which is obviously not a replacement for healthcare, for therapy, or for legal advice. But we hope if you are in need of support and care, that today's session will be reassuring and will provide you with the information to take the next steps in seeking some assistance for yourself. Okay, so I'd like, therefore, to introduce our panel. I've mentioned myself, my own role, but I'd like to invite our four brilliant panelists to give a quick 30-second introduction to themselves and to their role. So if we could start with you, Liz.
Hi there, I'm Liz Morrish, and I'm an independent scholar. I worked in academia as a principal lecturer in linguistics at Nottingham Trent University for 31 years, until I left academia in 2016, primarily because of audit culture. And I still publish and write in the field of critical university studies. I have a blog called Academic Irregularities. And my stance is primarily that academia has become what Richard Hall and Kate Bowles have called an anxiety machine, and that structures and incentives are inevitably going to lead to poor mental health outcomes for academics, and current performance management structures particularly feed into that.
Thank you, Liz, and I'm sure your perspectives will be extremely welcome today. Kalima.
Hi, so I'm Kalima Ibrahim. So I'm an occupational therapist by background. I'm also a lecturer in occupational therapy at the University of East London and the course leader for the BSc occupational therapy course there. I'm also a clinician, so I've worked in various clinical areas within the NHS, social care and prisons. I'm a doctorate student at the moment in public health and also an early career researcher, sorry.
Thank you, and it's great to have representation for your perspective, both as perhaps a student and as a member of staff as well, as an early career researcher. Thank you. Petra.
Hi, I'm Petra Boynton. I'm a social psychologist and agony aunt, and I'm interested particularly in making research easier to do, a bit more ethical and more enjoyable and inclusive. My main interest is on bullying in academia and also how we support staff to support one another. And like Liz, I was in academia. I was a senior lecturer in international healthcare, and I left a few years ago for pretty similar reasons, I think, that Liz described. So I'll be sort of talking from working within and outside academia.
Thank you. There's a huge wealth of experience you bring to this topic. And finally, Alan.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm Al Laville and I work at the University of Reading. I have two different roles there. So one is the Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, which I've been in post for about 3 years, and the other is Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology, and I've been in academia for about 12 years now. My main primary interest is looking at mental health in specific populations. I identify myself as neurodivergent and disabled, and have completed some research with students and researchers in those areas. And it's great to be invited today to the opportunity to bring in lived experience, but then also maybe some things that worked well for me and may work well for others.
Thank you. I think that'll be a really valuable combination for the discussion. I'd like to add to what our panelists have said that obviously we're not in this session speaking as mental health professionals offering clinical advice, but as you can see, our panel have got a huge amount of insights and commentary and ideas to share with us today. So very much appreciate your joining us. Thank you. Okay, just for our audience, if you are watching live today and you'd like to ask us a question, then you can click the Q&A button, which is, I'm told, at the top right hand of your Microsoft Teams screen, and enter your question there, and we'll set aside 10 minutes at the end to address the questions that have come through, as many as we can. But we have also prepared a list of questions for our panelists today, drawn from questions which have been submitted to us in advance. So this session is very much driven by our audience today. Okay, so for our first set of questions, I'd like to look at some of the biggest challenges to staff wellbeing in the higher education sector more generally, and what kinds of things might work to support staff mental health. We've had quite a few questions, in fact, from junior staff, from early career researchers and lecturers in particular, a few PhD students. Are there some areas within academia which are particularly prone to experiencing pressure and it gets better? Are there particular role types or personal circumstances that might be more heavily impacted, or do we see this issue being reflected right across the profession, affecting every kind of role, every kind of staff member? So I'd like to sort of consider that broader question as we look at some of the questions that have been submitted to us. So I'd like to ask firstly whether there's a link between staff mental health and lack of staff promotions in many higher education roles. So perhaps looking at the issue of precarity and progression. Liz and Kalima, perhaps if you could address this one for us.
Should I kick off?
Please do.
I think, given what I have said about performance management, I think the way it's structured in UK universities is most often outcomes-based performance management. So you're given targets at your annual appraisal, and these tend to be measurable things. So, you're often given targets like, you'll publish an article in, an A grade journal for the REF. They're not targets like, I will support students to better mental health, or I will support my colleagues to better mental health, because those things aren't measurable. So I think inevitably, if you can make a bargain with yourself to do a decent job in the best way you know how, and be the best supportive colleague you can be, and also the best teacher and best researcher you can be, and to do that in ways that you personally find rewarding rather than which are rewarded. If you can make that bargain with yourself and not expect to be rewarded, that probably is more realistic. I'm talking about managing expectations here. There are people who will go to management and say, what do I need to do to get promoted? Tell me what I need to do. And they will follow those things. and they will do it. And they seem to have longer careers, frankly. So, you know, I think you need to decide fairly early on, you know, given your experience and talking to older colleagues, what kind of academic is it that you want to be? Are you going to ignore unreasonable targets and, you know, be driven by the urgency of your curiosity-driven research, which is what most people find rewarding? So, you know, I think don't kid yourself that it's going to be purely merit-based is my advice.
Yeah, just echoing what Liz says, really. So obviously I'm the newest one to academia here than the rest of the panel. So yeah, I would say workload is an issue as well. So we need to obviously manage that, and I think it's managing expectations as well, and saying what can we do and what are we willing to do. So and also yes, not looking at being rewarded for things, because obviously there's the job that we have to do as well. So in my experience and the academics that I've spoken to as well, some of them say that they maybe struggle a little bit, maybe those who have maybe neurodivergent, have mental health conditions or long-term, you know, medical conditions and disabilities, etc., and feeling, you know, can they actually, do they want to, you know, do the hard slog through a, you know, long academic career, or is it something that they want to maybe consider doing other things? So I think it's very, very different. I think it's just a personal choice, really, and how much work that you're willing to put in, because it can be very, very stressful, especially those on, you know, precarious contracts and things. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, and I'd add very briefly from my own perspective as somebody who is a professional services rather than academic, the lack of promotion pathways for a lot of roles can be very frustrating, often means that you have to not be promoted, but leave that job and apply for another one, with the loss of, often, if you're moving institution, the support networks that you've got around you. So for professional services staff in our audience, I think it's not necessarily any easier there either. But thank you both. I'll pick up another question, which I think Petra and Kalima will particularly be able to comment on. Kalima, especially if you're also a PhD student at the moment. Are there any recommendations for reducing stress levels during the PhD journey specifically?
I thought,
Kalima,
do you mind going first on this one? Because I'd be interested in, you know, your experiences.
That's probably where my occupational therapy hat comes on as well, really. So I would say, yeah, prioritize your own health and well-being. And obviously I'm working as well as completing a doctorate as well. So, but yeah, prioritize your own health and well-being. And I think, you know, understand the source of your stress, because, you know, burnout can really sap your energy. And, you know, seek help early on, speak to your tutors, and try to engage in meaningful activities, anything that you like doing, anything that's, you know, healthy distractions, really. That's what I do. And, you know, social support, spend time with friends and family, you know, and not neglect those areas of your life. And I think because it all can blur, I think work and your research can all blur into one. So you're working in your personal life, in your weekends, evenings, as well as your day job, and you just sometimes can't differentiate between the two. So yeah, I try to have, you know, clear boundaries as well. So I think that's something that I would say. But I'm interested to hear, Petra, I know you've got a book on this area, so.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I'm, as you might have noticed, really useless at promoting my own book, so thank you for mentioning it. I might mention it again in a bit. Something I've noticed, I think particularly for PhDs, is that we used to teach routinely that suffering was a badge of honour. So that the only way through a PhD journey was to have a really, really difficult and awful time. And I would say, I hope, in most doctoral programmes now, that's not the way we teach, although there are still some people, I think, who do suggest it. But I've noticed that creeping in among postgraduates themselves. So it's almost like you're not having an authentic PhD experience if you're not having, you know, a difficult or challenging time. So I think to remember, as well as what Kalima said, it's a PhD should not make you unwell. It should not make you unhappy. It's going to be challenging, but it's something that you should want to do and that you should be supported to do. It's not something that should make you sick. So if it's doing those things, I think it's about seeking specific help and noting Is this something that you're driving yourself, or is it something that you're just being told by other people all the time? I think social media is both a blessing and a curse in this way, in that you've got people giving loads of good advice and networking and connecting, but you've also got quite a lot of competition going on about who's working the hardest or the longest. Or, oh, I never take breaks, or I never have holidays. So breaks, holidays, resting, you know, other interests, as Kalima has said, are hugely important. Your PhD is not the only thing in your life. You are becoming a well-rounded scholar, and a well-rounded scholar is not somebody who just studies all the time. They have other skills and a life as well. So I think that's really important to remember, especially when there's this sort of individualized pressure that you've got to be on the go all the time. The other thing is that I often hear from postgraduates that they say, I haven't asked anyone yet, but I know nobody would help me. And I think that partly comes from these sort of fear-mongering that other students might impose upon you. Now, it might be true that there is limited support, but I think in most cases there will be a postgraduate program, your supervisor, mentors, peer support, professional bodies, your funders, lots of different people, even the library, student support, all sorts of places that you could ask. And I think a lot of the time we don't know where to go. So finding somebody to ask and going from there is really, really important. You should be having meetings, you should be recording progress, but we're not always sure how much or when or how often. And some supervisors, admittedly, are much better at this than others, which means some people get a very unequal PhD experience, and that is not okay. So I think if you're tuning in today and thinking, oh gosh, I don't really know, you know, what I should expect, go back to your doctoral programme and ask, find out from there. Don't assume there isn't help without checking first. And for anybody who thinks they're entitled to or knows they're entitled to accommodations, those should be a priority as well. We hear increasingly from disabled students that they're not given things that they would make their life a lot easier. I would say when we hear about the mental health crisis among postgraduates, the main reason is no one tells them what to do. You know, they're not funded adequately and no one's telling them what they should be doing, and they get very, very frightened and upset, particularly because they think they should know, and especially for those in dual roles where they're also teaching and working at the same time. And just very quickly, I would say there's also the student of the PhD journey is not just the journey of the student, it's the journey of the supervisor. So if any of you are early career researchers or new to supervision, then you do need to be in a situation where you get support and training and advice as well, because in my experience, a lot of supervisors are thrown into that role with no help, loads of pressure, and then they get criticised for not doing a job that no one taught them to do. So I think that's also really important as well. You should not be doing this job without support there for you.
Thank you. That's a really useful insight, I think, looking at the role of the supervisor as well, and the fact they may need some development around this area and not just supervising the thesis to completion. Thank you. Okay, a related question then, because I think some of these habits and mindsets that we set up as doctoral students can then see us through the next few years of our career into early career researchers, postdocs, and beyond early lecturer roles. How do I negotiate workload in the face of work-related mental health issues? I'd like to bring Alan in here as well, and also Liz. So Alan, if you could respond to that with any insights.
Sure, absolutely. I think there's two parts that come to mind for me. There's the good, I try and avoid the word best practice because that's so subjective, isn't it? But the good practice of having a very clear workload model or a structured amount of work within the week. And I read recently on Twitter in terms of the amount of work that should be completed within a particular time. If you're spending way beyond what you should do, it's perhaps often an overload of work that has been allocated to you. In terms of that sort of the general approach, really, and I'm fortunate that in the school I work in, that we do have that structured approach and you know what you can cover and when throughout the week. But looking at the other part of the question is around mental health and adjustments. I would personally say from my own experience is to go through the formal process such as occupational health. That's what I found really useful. It might be that your line manager is really responsive and you have informal reasonable adjustments that are put into place. But I've personally found there's more security going through the occupational health with the recommendations coming from that. But of course, there's another layer, isn't there, to consider there, in terms of if someone has disclosed or is looking to disclose mental health difficulties or disability or neurodivergency, in terms of the impact that's currently on their workload. So it might be, regardless of what I've just said, whoever you feel safest speaking to and whoever you feel that listens to you the most, and that might be your line manager or someone centrally, and taking it from there. But then having a process and having it in writing would be the way forward, because I've heard of cases where people say, well, we discussed this, we agreed that, and it's not happened, and then there isn't that written evidence to support it. So being mindful of making sure that is in place.
Thank you. How about you, Liz?
Yeah, workload models, I think, have a seductive appeal. They appear to rationalize something which, it's still quite difficult to measure. Very often people get notional hours which really don't reflect how long the task takes. And, this is as true of research as it is of teaching. There's a really serious question of, how on earth you go public with this. Do you go to your head of department and say, I'm really struggling with this workload? Or do you go to your colleagues and say, are you finding that the workload model doesn't reflect how long the tasks take, and try and have some collective action? You might find that similar tasks are credited with hours, very different hours across the university. So, what does the business school do? What does the law school do in crediting hours for teaching, say? Does everybody get some time built in for research? And there's also a question of headroom. So, at the beginning of the year, when you get your workload allocated, you don't know that a few weeks down the line, a colleague may get sick and you have to take over some of their work, or something else happens and another task is loaded onto you, or there's a PhD that you agree to examine. And these things need doing. And they also, so, there should be some kind of spare time built into the workload, which will inevitably be filled. And it's about universities having trust. You can only manage in a university with trust, that academics can be to some degree self-managing within, the scope of accountability. I think it's worth looking at red flags, like, do you have new modules to teach? Do you have a book contract? And having those conversations very early on with your line manager. And yes, occupational health is extremely helpful. I certainly found occupational health extremely helpful. But also there are wider questions about, fairness and consistency. So is there a workload committee that you can join? And also, is your union on board with this? Are they alert to the issues about workloads?
Thank you. And I think a final question from our audience, which is really relevant to the questions that we've already discussed, is preventing yourself from burnout at these periods of high workload or high stress. And I wondered, Petra and Alan, if you could offer any quick tips on preventing burnout or addressing burnout.
Alan, do you want to start and I'll jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yes, I think it's very much about those honest conversations with yourself and with others. So, as we've just heard from Liz, I think there is the responsibility on leaders really to regularly review the processes that are in place. And again, that's something that happens automatically where I work, and it's not to show back and say how lucky I am, because I've had awful experiences before this. But it shouldn't, all the emphasis shouldn't be on the person taking it to these people. If there's an inclusive environment, it should be leaders that are opening that safe space to provide that feedback. I think in terms of burnout and what we were discussing earlier, is that there is very much, or look, aren't I the busiest? And as colleagues have already shared, I haven't taken a break, I haven't taken any holidays. And I remember, and I'm a very driven person, but I will absolutely take all of my annual leave and I will turn my emails off as soon as I finished work and go on the next morning. And I've got that from my experiences of burning myself out, because it's very easy to be sucked in, I think, to that culture. So I'd say the first bit was very much putting the boundaries in place. So there could be, I think, this thinking and this thought, or there's almost anxiety that's generated. Oh, I must check my emails at 10 o'clock before I go to bed. And I would say, from reflection, that's nonsense, because you're not going to make any meaningful difference at that point in the evening compared to, you know, picking it up the next day in the morning. And also thinking around the workload that you have and what is being asked of you, but then also what is the diversity within that workload. So what I mean by that is, when I line manage about 10 or 11 people now, and it's not necessarily about the volume of the work, it's about the variety of the work. So if you are engaging in exciting projects, new teaching or new research, that's not in addition to your other work, but instead of, that can be a big motivator. And also making sure that then you've got that balance across those different tasks that you're completing. I think if you are at that point that you're listening on the call and thinking, well, how do I know if I'm burnt out? My experiences are, if you start finding even an email too much, if someone's disagreeing with you and you become really, really quite cross, and that's quite irrational for you as a person, that's another sign of burnout. If you're going to bed really, really early, and it can appear as self-care, or I need to get in a good night's sleep and go to bed early, but actually your work's caused you to be so exhausted, you're now losing out on your evenings and your socialising, and ultimately becoming more isolated. So I'd look for those warning signs that essentially, is there anything behaviourally, or, you know, the thoughts that are going through your mind that's changed and shifted, and is that a character for you? And then perhaps that's the time to think about putting the boundaries into place.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and I think that when those symptoms start to show, I think that's time to build in a break. And very often when we are stressed or at risk of burnout, you know, the temptation is almost to overwork to catch up with it. And actually that's probably about the worst thing to do. And I often hear from people saying, oh, well, I can't possibly take a break. But actually, if you're at that I can't possibly take a break stage, then that is the absolute time to take a break. I would also say that not leaving it too long to see your GP if you can't get this sorted yourself, and that's either because your symptoms are worsening, or your physical or mental health symptoms are worsening, or that the pressure around you is beyond your control. So, you know, things like if you've tried speaking to your union, if you've tried to address your workload, if there's bullying going on. Bullying drives burnout a lot, actually. I think that people, it's not just a sort of, I think burnout's become a phrase we've heard of a lot, particularly during the pandemic, and it's almost as if it just is something you catch, a bit like a cold, and it doesn't, you know, it's not something that's actually embedded in the system that makes you sick. I think that burnout is very often happening because you can't escape. You can't get away, and so the things you would normally do to relax or to manage your time or to have reasonable adjustments or have you know, helpful and reliable, sensible people around you who are all supportive and great, none of those things exist. And worst case scenarios is you've got sort of abuse and prejudice and outright hostility. In those cases, you're going to get burnt out because you're just trying to survive. So I think that's worth looking at, thinking about. Some people leave. Some people leave academia. Either they leave that department or that university or that job, they go and get a different job, they go and do something else. It is not, if it's not fixable, and some places are not, it is not worth staying and making yourself that unwell. If they are not supportive of you to get yourself better, then you've got to think about, is it, you know, why am I giving all my time to people who want to be unkind to me? Why would I do that? At the end of the day, I know this is probably a weird thing to say because we sort of treat academia as it's so special, but it's a job, you know, and I think that we are worried about having other jobs, but this is not the only job you could have with all the many, many, many skills that academia will have given you and you probably don't recognise. So when you're really burnt out, it's not necessarily the time to make big life-changing decisions without support, therapy, coaching, counselling, whatever, and a break. But I think it's worth thinking about. If you're feeling that desperate, you need to step off and seek help and talk to somebody else. I think the other thing to remember is that the burnout does not necessarily come from the university. It might be grief. It might be that you're dealing with, as a carer, you've got dependents, you're dealing with other health issues or other life issues, or your relationship's broken down, perhaps you're navigating, trying to cope with domestic violence. There could be all kinds of things happening in your own life that are big enough, and then you add the workplace stress as well. So I think it's working out what's causing that burnout and who can help me start to step back and then to regroup and work out where I need to go.
Thank you. There's a lot of really powerful insights there, I think, and we've looked a lot about what we can do as individuals, but we've also spoken, I think, about what institutions can and need to do in order to support us. And I'd like to pursue that a little bit further in the next set of questions that we've been asked. To what extent it's a matter of individual interventions, we need to take care of our own mental health and well-being, and to what extent actually the institutions need to be doing more to support us. So we've had questions from people who I think are wanting to support their colleagues. What could they do perhaps for people they are line managing? So if we start off with what measures can I take as an academic to promote or support mental health awareness? And Liz and Kalima, could you kick us off with that one? Perhaps starting with Liz and then Kalima.
Okay, so what can I do to support mental health of colleagues in my institution? Well, formal and informal structures exist. You can have, informally trusted colleagues, especially if there's been a very damaging incident. You may seek to, ask colleagues advice, or perhaps ask them to keep a record for you if you don't feel able to do that yourself, almost as a kind of witness to your distress. Formal structures, obviously occupational health, although sometimes if they in your institution sit within HR, that can seem a bit of a barrier for some people, almost as if whatever you disclose might become part of your permanent record or be discussed with line managers. That's sometimes a fear, and I think institutions really need to take that on board. But occupational health can make those recommendations for adjustments to workloads and how to, bring you back into the workplace, particularly after sickness absence. And so that is enormously helpful and supportive.
Thank you. Kalima, with your background in occupational health, this might be something that you also would have quite a lot to say to.
Oh yeah, occupational therapy. Yeah, so I would say prioritise our own health and wellbeing, as I said before, but also try and create a culture where we have these discussions with staff and also senior leadership. I think it's everyone's business and it's not just us on the ground. And I think that obviously senior leadership also needs to start, encouraging mental health awareness. I know there obviously are formal and informal support from your organisation in terms of like counselling services, etc. But also encourage conversations, raise any issues, unmanageable workloads. If you witness discrimination in terms of allyship, if you witness any discrimination for anything, anything that contributes to our mental ill health. And I think that we need to also, be an ally for one another, and also to try and create that positive work environment that we're all comfortable and we all feel that we belong in that, and we're not overworking ourselves and making ourselves unwell. So and working as a team, I think that's really important.
Thank you. We have a very similar question actually, which I'd like to open up to Petra and Alan. How can I support the mental health of my team of academics and suggest resources that I can recommend?
I'm okay to start on this one. I would say the interesting thing about this is that universities are talking a lot about mental health, not necessarily putting things into action, and certainly not whole campus approaches and all year round. So we're here talking about it today, but we really should be talking about this every day in lots of different ways. And one thing I've noticed is that there's a huge burden on minoritised academics to take on the people who are either the people that are, students or staff in crisis are sent to. So, go and talk to so-and-so, they're friendly, they're helpful, or, they're disabled, so they'll understand your disability, even if it's got absolutely nothing to do with, their life experience at all. So there's a lot of assumptions that certain people will take on a sort of wellbeing, safety and pastoral care work. There's also a lack of valuing said work. So I think, as we've been hearing earlier, these are not things that are included in metrics. You're not assessed on whether you do this work, and in many cases it can count against you. And I think that's often manifested in the way that universities either expect staff to go and find out things for themselves, or students. So if somebody comes to you and talks about maybe their relationship being in crisis, you know, your guess is as good as anybody's, really, if this isn't some way you've got experience of what to offer them. And as a consequence, people are offered all sorts of weird and wonderful advice at the times when they most need it, or sometimes discouraged from seeking help. But the other thing is, there's a sort of real emphasis on sending people links, lots of links to websites, lots of free resources, whereas actually the university should be investing in training, support, supervision. So there are things like learning psychological first aid, how to become an ally or an active bystander, how to listen. But some of the skills you might learn there, especially if you're picking up free resources or courses yourself, they're not necessarily set up for universities. They're not really set up for diverse audiences. And I'll give you one example. If you've ever done how to listen training, very often the first thing they'll tell you is to show that you're listening, you must give eye contact at all times. Now, for a lot of people, that's not something they can do. It's deeply uncomfortable. It's not culturally unique or the same across everywhere. Some people find that really intimidating. You know, not everybody wants to sit and look at somebody else while they're doing it, and not everyone can see that well. So, you know, there's a whole issue around some of the things we're taught to do. So I would say that, yes, we can recommend things, but I'm always wary of quick Google search and sending it on. We don't know whether that stuff's any good. You need to know, is it current? Is it appropriate? You know, if you're referring somebody to a crisis helpline and they're concerned about their sexuality, is this actually going to support them, or is it conversion therapy? If they're worried that they're pregnant, are they going to get pregnancy advice, or it's actually going to be shaming them for it? So you really need to be very careful, I think, around who we're asking to do this help. And I don't mean that it should all become really standardised, because I think that becomes really boring as well. But it's the sense that it's just left us, because it's not prioritised, to scrabble around finding resources and hope for the best. It needs to be a lot more structured than that. Having said that, we are going to do exactly the opposite at the end of this and give you a whole link to loads of websites, but I think they have all been checked, and I hope they are all useful to you. And if you've got questions about how you actually access that care, at risk of plugging my own book again, it is explained in Being Well in Academia on actually how you ask for that help. So yeah, that's what I would do.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting here, Petra, to talk about particularly around what is the institution doing, and I think there is a lot, isn't there, around we're mental health aware, etc., etc. But what does it actually look like? What does it actually mean? And we engaged in a significant piece of work, me and another colleague on the executive board, one of our PVCs, looking at disability, neurodiversity, mental health, and chronic long-term illness for staff. And engaging in many different listening exercises there, which of course, myself included, it's a motive to continually bring up your lived experience. But from that, very much thinking about the training. What training is there for staff? What awareness training is there? For line managers, what toolkit is there? I think there's a lot of assumptions that all line managers, similar as we were discussing earlier with PhD supervisors, I think there's a lot of parallels in the sense that, oh, well, you've got a PhD now, or you've managed before, so you can just do this role. Whereas actually what support is there for that individual to develop and grow in terms of that specific role? Not everyone can manage, not everyone can lead. I think that there needs to be those support processes in place. And thinking around, one of the best resources that I've found, because of what you can take away from it, is by Mental Health UK, that have a series of booklets. And the first two in their list on their web pages, which for me, I put Mental Health UK resources into Google and it brought it straight up, is looking at how to have conversations with people. So I think, again, around mental health, I mean, specifically, there's that assumption that everyone will be comfortable or know how to identify particular symptoms, or there's in the guide there, the do's and don'ts. I think it's very easy to go into a sympathy mode rather than an empathic mode. And also thinking about what is the person willing to share and what are they saying, and also thinking that you're confident in the advice that you're giving, just as Petra said, around, I would always think about what evidence-based resources are there, because we know there's a lot that's not evidence-based, that's on the web, and making sure that what we're offering is useful. But I'd say both for how to have conversations with colleagues, but also how to support yourself, the Mental Health UK resources, one example that I like, some people find it too simplistic, but I really like it, is thinking about the stress bucket and explicitly identifying each layer of stress and pressure. And I think that's really useful in conceptualizing when people say, yeah, well, stress is useful, it drives you, but then actually when does it come too much and how do you identify that? And that's one of the resources that they provide.
Thank you. So there's a lot out there, but perhaps we should be looking towards staff development rather than giving already stressed and overburdened people a lot of information which may not be useful and may actually add to the problem rather than helping them address it. Yeah, thank you. Some really useful pointers there. We had a couple of questions actually specifically around anxiety. One from the perspective of an early career researcher, how can I overcome anxiety and have a positive insight within my role? And I think many of us are aware of the pressures that are on early career researchers and precarity in the short-term contracts. Excuse me. And also a second question that's related to it, can you cover any self-help tips to deal with feeling anxious in the workplace after interacting with colleagues? Obviously, speaking to colleagues about mental health, or indeed anything, sometimes can be a source of anxiety. So any tips to address that? And I think Petra and Kalima, if you could address that particular question for us.
Kalima, are you all right to start on this again? I feel with your occupational therapy role, you're going to know this better.
Well, yeah, maybe we'll see. So yeah, so I would say. So what was the question before the first part of the question? Sorry.
How to overcome anxiety and have a positive insight or attitude within the role as an early career researcher, but also generally self-help tips about feeling anxious in the workplace after interacting with colleagues.
Yeah, and yes, I would say maybe try to think about the reason for the anxiety. Is it your interaction with the colleague, or is it uncomfortable conversation for yourself, or is it uncomfortable for the colleague, or if you don't have that culture maybe where you're able to, you know, be open and honest? I think we'll start there. And I also think that, yeah, the previous speaker as well spoke about what services are available as well. But I also thinking about when we go to, you know, call, you know, counselling line for our institution, if they provide a counselling line, things like that. So I also think about, is that person trained as well? Well, not necessarily trained, they are trained, but I mean in terms of trauma-informed care, in terms of the discussions that we might have about maybe sexuality, about racism and those things, are they able to support us in those instances as well? So that's something that I've always been thinking about actually for a while now, actually, for a personal interaction that I've had. So I would say yes. So obviously you've got your, you know, different counselling services, occupational health, etc. And also remembering that when you're an early career researcher, that the work you're doing is actually really important. You're actually adding to the, you know, the research base, you know, globally as well. So I think to recognise that the work that you're doing, or that we're doing, is really important work as well. So to have some kind of maybe, you know, feel good about that as well. But I think it's, yeah, the anxiety it's very personal and isn't very individualized. So I think it's about finding out what the issues might be and how we can, yeah, could be signposted to extra support to help manage that. So, and especially if it's crippling as well, that we need to address that, because it can stop us doing a lot of things that we might need to do or want to do.
I would just add, I think, to what Kalima said here, that I think there is, you know, the idea that a lot of things that happen in our life, in and outside our work or our study, can make us feel anxious and make us feel unsettled or uncertain. And I think sometimes we use anxiety as a cover-all phrase to mean lots of different things. It's like I'm a bit uncomfortable today, or I'm not feeling very confident, or I'm not sure if I'm going to manage this presentation, or I don't really like my colleague very much. You know, it's normal to feel anxious and uncomfortable in stressful situations, but I think there is also the situation where anxiety can become so overwhelming that you can't function as normal, you can't enjoy life as normal, that you're unable to relax, and it's actually starting to make you physically quite unwell. I struggle with anxiety a lot, and it's absolutely miserable. It really, really is. So I would say if it's moving beyond just feeling occasionally a bit wobbly through to actually taking over your day, again, I would seek medical advice on that. And I would also see if there are some ways you can pinpoint the source of the anxiety. Sometimes it's hard to, but sometimes it's related to a particular person, a particular activity. Sometimes it's fixable, as in you feeling anxious because you've got to go and do field work and you haven't got the adequate equipment. If you've got the adequate equipment, you actually might now feel okay to go and do the field work. And it's quite natural to feel anxious if you've not got the right equipment to go and do field work. But it could easily be that you have no idea why you're feeling as bad as you do. You just do. And that needs to go and get help. Something I found helps quite a lot is that there's lots of resources that have been created, particularly during the pandemic, for children and young people on understanding and managing anxiety. And sometimes when we're really, really anxious, it's very difficult to read a complicated book that explains everything. So some of the evidence-based techniques that can be used to help calm your breathing, or to actually look at, you know, how anxious you are. So a really simple one, and you can see my hands, is that, you know, most of us might be around here for anxiety, and at different points in the day or the week, your anxiety is going to go out until it's eventually, you know, somewhere around here. You know, if you're able to think about physically or drawing, where am I today in terms of my anxiety, and when it's waxing and waning, and is that starting to feel out of control, and why is that happening? Breathing activities, as I said, trying on things that might work for you. I would say that the university's favourite things at the moment, if people are feeling anxious, is we'll do a yoga session, and that might be great if that works for you. But for some people, it actually doesn't work for them. It's physically difficult to get into. It makes them feel really uncomfortable. Some of the breathing and relaxation activities really trigger people. So I would say that if you're going to explore some ways of supporting yourself, it's going slowly and it's going safely. And again, if it's a real chronic problem for depression, for anxiety, or other severe mental illness, because that's always missed out, actually, when we're talking about mental health. We only really talk about mild to moderate anxiety and depression, and there's a lot more mental illness we could be discussing that doesn't get cleared up with a course of CBT and doesn't go away very easily, that we need to have patterns in place for when we're ill, how to look after ourselves, how to get help, and the fact that with a lot of mental illness, it comes and goes. So there'll be times when we're more poorly and we do need help in those times.
Thank you. That's really useful. There's clearly a lot of value in sharing experiences and sharing support, as hopefully our audience are finding today. And we just have one more question, I think, from our pre-submitted questions that would be really useful to address before we move into the open questions. We've already discussed a little bit about where individual people can look to find mental health and wellbeing support within their institutions. But in terms of support groups, whether they're online or offline, what online support groups are available that you're aware of, and where would someone look to build a support network if there isn't one that already exists? That question, I think, if Alan and Petra could deal with that one for us, and Liz and Kalima, if you have insights on that one too, feel free to chip in.
I'm happy to go first on this one. That's all right. Yeah, so I think in terms of looking at support, it very much, I'm going to be very honest here. I think it depends on exactly what type of support you're looking for. And when we're looking at support groups, is it very much a support group that is underlined by psychotherapeutic principles, or is it more of a befriending and a discussion, and for particular individuals? And I've personally found on the Mind website, I think they're one of the best, the charity, I mean Mind, to focus on when we experience, say, as other colleagues have shared today, discrimination, prejudice and bullying. It may be, in my case, is ableism or biphobia. And looking at the impact that has on mental health, I found it in this instance much more useful to speak to others that have had similar types of pressures, and the impact that's had on them. And I found that the Mind Resource Directory covers that really well. And also thinking about the support and discussions, there's often, it depends again, is it more of a group support or is it one-to-one? And often people think of the Samaritans as a line that I only can call if I'm at risk to myself or to others, and that's not the case. And if it's that you wanted to have a discussion or to, as other colleagues have said, to help unpick or unpack what you're currently experiencing, because you simply may not make head or tail of it, and I certainly didn't for a long time. Or it might be more around, similar to the one I mentioned earlier about the Mental Health UK. They have an online platform called Click, which doesn't have a K, it's CLIC. And that could be asking questions on an FAQ or a discussion board, or it could be more like supportive group based. And my understanding is that that's free of charge as well, and people can access that, because for many, myself included, I get really tired of continuously reading a lot, and I just want to talk about something. So that platform would be much more useful for people that may just want to talk about it rather than continue reading these documents about what they may or may not be experiencing.
Thank you. We're just keeping an eye on the time before we move into the questions submitted live. Did any of our other panellists have anything they wanted to add on the subject of support groups? Liz, I think you were indicating.
Yeah, I think people should just have in mind that one statistic that I mentioned in my report to HEPI, pressure vessels on academics and mental health, was that 43% of academics exhibit symptoms of a mental health disorder. So it shouldn't be a stigma. And, you know, if somebody like Alan can, you know, raise these issues, somebody who's at a fairly senior level, that's really helpful. One university president in Canada, Santa Ono, actually came out and talked about his struggles with anxiety and depression. And I think that's admirable. And everybody suffers from imposter syndrome from day one till the day you retire. And, you know, I think one strategy that everybody can employ is just, you know, remind yourself you are a high achiever, or else you wouldn't have got through all the hoops to where you are today. And, you know, think about the things that you have achieved, whether it's the student you successfully counseled, or the book prize that you were nominated for, or the feedback you got at a conference. You know, mentally count those positives, because you will need to draw on those things to counter some of the other messages which institutions will keep sending to you.
Thank you. And I think now we've got 5 minutes or so to answer some of the questions that have been submitted during the session. I'm afraid we won't have time to answer all of them, but there are some excellent questions here. There's a very general question, more broadly, about, are there any good wellbeing initiatives for staff run at UK universities besides counselling, which is usually standard? Are there any good initiatives that you're aware of, panel, from your work in the sector?
There's Step Change, which is from Universities UK, which is about sort of a whole campus, whole approach to mental health. Interestingly, quite a lot of funding bodies have got interested in addressing bullying. So they haven't necessarily got statements on mental health, but they've got policies on safe working practices, which incorporate addressing bullying and harassment among and aimed at staff. And a lot of the research concordats also, although they're focusing sort of on ethics and research, and you might assume that it's about participants and research conduct, also apply to the safeguarding of researchers and looking at them. And in fact, the most recent ones I've been reading now specify that you have to have safer working places. The World Health Organization has also just introduced a new policy on safe working practices, which is probably useful to wave at and draw upon if you wanted to. I would say with a lot of these things, the tricky bit is that people keep making all these different policies and then they don't share them and they disappear off, or that they aren't looked at critically, and I think they do need looking at critically, but that doesn't mean to say that we just ignore them completely, because they can be helpful, I think, especially when we're trying to negotiate at a sort of, you know, top level of why we want change and sort of whole campus trauma-informed, accessible and inclusive practice, that there is policy and practice to draw upon to do that.
Thank you. And we have a couple of more specific questions which look at how those policies might be implemented to better support the welfare of particular groups. For example, we have one question: how can university staff who are carers be better supported? Because not all universities seem to have any form of carer policy for staff, sometimes for students, but not necessarily for staff. And another question, how is it best to support staff who want to progress through academia who identify as having a disability? And I wondered if from the panel, and if you felt you could speak to either the issue of how best to support carers or how best to support disabled staff. Alan and Kalima have both indicated.
I'm happy to take the question in terms of disability, and I'll try and be quick because I'm aware of time. But actually, I think in terms of what we've experienced in our approach is very much thinking about what is there with a system. I'll take academic promotions, for example, that there's often, I think, we talk about students, the hidden curriculum. I think there's also like hidden guidance as well in terms of promotion. So at Reading at the moment, we're engaging, looking at those colleagues identified as disabled that have been promoted, buddying and mentoring other colleagues, where it's going away from the document, the process, and what have people actually lived through and how have they worked out what's required in order to be promoted. But also, more than that, is finding your own way there. So I thought to myself, if I'm a lecturer for the rest of my days, then I'm a lecturer for the rest of my days, but I'm going to do what I want to do. And I think it's finding more people that think and work in that way. There's not many of us, I don't think, but then supporting each other to more of a community support.
Thank you. Kalima, did you want to add something briefly?
Yeah, just in terms of obviously carers and disabilities, as well as accessing the services. So make sure that you disclose things as well. So you go to maybe to access to work or occupational health, and try to get that support in place as well to take you through your journey as well. So I think early on, because if you wait later on, sometimes I think it's quite difficult to maybe speak and manage everything after that. So I think being open and honest and transparent in the beginning, and also, but I know there's a flip side to that as well, where people might not want to be because they might think it might stop promotions and the jobs. So I think it's that balance, and I think it's what you feel comfortable. It's quite like a two-sided coin, really, isn't it? So.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have time for. I'd like to close by very briefly asking each of our panelists to share one top tip, a very short, punchy top tip, just to close the session off for us before we end. Liz, do you want to go first?
Okay, my top tip is universities will tell you almost entirely through your career that you have not yet arrived. You are still in development. You still need training. And I would advise people, take that seriously. You may have a very short career because of the way universities are structured now, because of the stresses we've been talking about. Just imagine that your career in a university may be 10, 15 years. What are you going to do outside of that? What skills will you need? So do take moments to document those and seek to develop your skills and competencies so that, you can be marketable in the outside world.
Thank you. So continue to develop yourself. Kalima, how about you? Short tip from you.
Yeah, I would say, continue to develop yourself, and also prioritize our own health and look after us, because we've only got one body. So I think if we don't look after ourselves, no one else will. So I think that will be my top tip.
Thank you. Prioritize yourself. How about you, Alan?
I would say if your institution has a staff disability network or a network that acknowledges mental health, I found that really empowering to access that. And if your institution doesn't, maybe considering about setting one up. And I found that really empowering, that then you realise, yes, there's the rhetoric that goes around the institution, but then there's all these people with lived experience, and actually the two are quite different. And that's really helped me to be more confident speaking about my own experiences.
Thank you. And finally, Petra.
join a union. We're stronger together. And you know, there's lots of unions, there's lots of staff, there's lots of people working in lots of areas in universities. There's not one union. You can find yourself a support network, and that can start with friends and family. It can be people who've got nothing to do with university and couldn't be less interested in it. They're often the best allies to have. And also, I think, you know, have a safe space. You don't ever feel you're on your own. Have people backing you up. And that gives you the courage, I think, to speak out and to be an ally. So, you know, it's very hard to do this on our own, but it's not hard if all of us do it together. And if we're tired, then the people who are a bit less tired can take over in the non-tired times.
Thank you all four of you. That was a fantastically positive way to bring the session to a close. I'd like to remind the people who are with us today on the call, if you're looking for any more information on any of these topics, then we've got, of course, careeradvice.jobs.ac.uk, and there is also, if I may promote, Advanced HE. If you're going to Advanced HE, there may be some useful resources there to support you. The recording of this webinar is going to be available next week on the jobs.ac.uk website. So if you'd like to revisit any of the things that we've been discussing or share it with people in your network to help you in your own work to support colleagues, then please visit the website and follow on social media. And on behalf of jobs.ac.uk and Advanced HE, I'd really like to thank our four panellists today for their time, for their expertise, for their compassion, and for everything that they've shared. And thank you for watching, everybody. And we hope that you find the information useful. We will be sharing, as Petra said, some of the resources that we feel you might find helpful in your own practice, in your own work, in your own life circumstances. Thank you ever so much for joining us, everyone, and goodbye.